So first of all, thank all of you all for joining Tumbao today in their first ever episode entitled Tumbando El Sistema, One Talk at a Time. These are conversations that will happen weekly just on the conversation of race. Knowing that the times that we're in right now are very difficult and that race is at the forefront and should be at the forefront of a lot of the conversations and the decisions that we're making right now. Off the heels of the George Floyd murder, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Dominique Fales, and Tony McDade. We just really saw the value and the importance of having these conversations with our own community here at Lehigh. And so we have a great opportunity to talk about race and how it impacts our own lives. And we have a great panel that will be here with you all today. My name is Arsenio Pierre. I serve as the Assistant Dean and Director for the Office of Student Engagement. And today we're going to be talking about race, ethnicity, and nationality, and what does that mean in this context. We recognize that sometimes people don't necessarily know what that means and the differences between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So we kind of want to spend some time at the beginning of this conversation just really talking about that very topic. So I want to start with first you, Ray, and talking a little bit about at what moment did you first realize your race, ethnicity, and your nationality? And I kind of want everyone to go around and just speak on that, but we'll start with you, Ray.
So, like I said, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and here has a very strong Latinx population, but majority of the Latinx population is from Mexico. And when I was younger, I spoke Portuguese up to the age of 7. And if you don't know, anyone from Brazil is under the Latinx category, but I don't technically look like the traditional Latinx person or what Latinx people generally look like in the country. So anyone who was Mexican and they would be like, oh, you're not Latinx, you're Black. So I took that upon myself to kind of research the differences between race and ethnicity, or like see if you can actually be Black and Latinx at the same time. Because my grandmother, she's from Brazil, she's born and raised there. She's a Black woman, but she's under the Latinx ethnicity. So I feel like it's really important to learn the difference between the two.
Then I move to Joey. What about you?
Yeah, so growing up, I knew I was white. I knew that I had some grandparents, great-grandparents who came into Ellis Island, and then they moved to Ohio. They're Italian immigrants. But the first moment I realized that race was impacting me differently from other people was probably I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I was playing soccer on a team where everybody else on the team except for me was Salvadoran. So at that point, I grew up kind of sheltered. I mean, I went to this tiny preschool with like 5 or 6 kids, and I just began to realize like we got looked at differently when we would show up to soccer tournaments, or we would get looked at differently if we went to go and eat in between tournaments. And from there, it was just kind of like, all right, well, I'm being treated differently from all of my friends because of my skin tone, and I want to figure out how I can help them be more understood and be there and listen and figure out how I can best use my privilege to understand and be an ally. So that was my perspective coming up and going into Lehigh. And from there, the Africana Studies minor, as a history kid, I was shocked to take all these history classes throughout high school and going to public high school and not having any idea what was happening in Africa up until World War II. It was just kind of mind-boggling to me. So I figured if I can do my best to learn about people with different backgrounds from me, I can use my privilege in a way that's positive.
Thank you. We're going to move to Tasneem.
So my race is Asian, but when people think of Asian, they don't really think of me. They think of Chinese people or Korean people. They don't even think of Russia. Russian people, some of them are also Asian, but I am Asian, and I didn't really know the difference between ethnicity and race from a very early age of mine, because I would always say I'm Bengali and nobody would know what that is. But then on top of that, people would always generalize the Arab culture, Middle Eastern culture with brown culture, Desi culture, which is Pakistani, Indian, and Bengali people, and just not know the difference, because then there comes an idea called religion, where people think that being Muslim is also an ethnicity. So then that's also generalized. So like if my mom's wearing a hijab, they think that she's Arab. But Arab people aren't all Muslim, and the number one Muslim country is in Asia, which is Indonesia. Um, so there's like a very big confusion within religion, culture, race, so many of these things. And that's probably because we create our own histories and we don't really know what any of this means, probably because it's a social construct. And whoever writes these history, which is in the perspective of the victory person, they tend to not care about other perspectives and only care about their perspectives and stabilizing those contexts instead of other contexts.
Thank you. Yeah, Gabby, talk to us a little bit about how you recognize or when you recognize your race, ethnicity, and nationality.
I think for me, there was some point in high school where they officially started like taking the term like Hispanic / Latino off of any form you fill out. So like the census, like medical forms, anything like that, like Hispanic was no longer a race. So then I had a moment where I was like, well, I know that I don't live a white experience because usually people don't see me as white. Like I started to pick up on that. Like doctors, they just noted me as Black or African American without asking me what race I identified with or what ethnicity I was or anything. And I started to pick up on that, and I wasn't sure why. And then as I entered Lehigh, actually, people would always ask me, so you're like white and Black? And I was like, no, actually, like I'm Dominican and Panamanian. And then they'd always be like, more ignorant people would be like, prove it, like can you speak Spanish? And I would just be like, well, I'm not going to speak Spanish to prove my like ethnicity. Like I know like where I came from. And so it was just like a confusing time period. So then that's when I started to kind of like Google like can you be like Black and Latinx at the same time. And that was before I think the term Afro Latinx came into play. I think it was more like towards 2016 before that became a popular phenomenon.
Thank you. Jamal.
Okay. So my grandma is from the Philippines. So like when I go, going to church is like a thing for family. I have a Black church I go to, but I also go to Iglesia Ni Cristo, which is like a Filipino church. So like I would go there and like meet my cousins and stuff. And like I don't like just being little kids. Like sometimes they touch my hair, sometimes I touch their hair, and like it was different. Like I didn't have long straight hair. I had like more tightly coiled hair. So I feel like that was like the first time I realized that that was the first time I realized that I wasn't just like my cousins, because like we were all treated the same, but like we looked the same, but we had different hair textures. The first time I realized I was American, I feel like I've always identified as like a Philadelphian. I'm from Philly. I don't know everyone's American experience, but I know how Philly is. But when I went to Rome, like through Lehigh Iacocca internship, I realized that I'm an American. Like and it was really confusing, like being Black, being a college student, being an American in Rome. And it took me going to different places to like solidify my my grasp of this like American identity, because I never really gave it much attention, and that comes from a very unique place of privilege.
Thank you. Nat.
So coming from the Bronx, I went to like middle school in the Bronx, very diverse. I never really thought about it. I grew up in Fordham on the Bronx, and like everyone speaks Spanish, so it just never was anything that like it was just my life. But I went to high school in Manhattan on the Upper East Side, and that was, I think, the first time that there was just like a really big shift where I realized like, oh, the Bronx isn't like everywhere else. Like this isn't how the world is. Where I realized that me not being white was different, or just being aware of the different like privileges, because it was a private school. So just sitting at lunch and like having people in my class like going out on their lunch break and coming back with like $200 pair of jeans when I like was struggling to like pay my lunch for the day was like, I think the first time that I like really realized the differences and how race can play into those privileges.
Thank you. Carla.
So for me, it was like mainly when I was growing up, like my mom, like she goes by like Morena or Negra, like that's what the family calls her. So like in English, that's like dark skinned woman, black skinned woman. So like growing up, like that's just kind of like the identity that I grew up with. But similar to Gabby, like it wasn't until like I had to start filling out forms that I was like, oh, you know, like I don't fit into anything else. Like I'm not white, I'm not Asian, I'm not Native American or whatever the other options are, but black. So that's when I like realized like, yeah, I'm black. And then also similar to Natalie, like I come from the Bronx too, around the Fordham area as well. So like I never faced those extreme differences till I actually got to Lehigh's campus.
Wow, thank you. And then Adrian.
Yeah, kind of similar to Gabby and Carla. It was only through forms that I actually realized that, you know, race and ethnicity was a thing. So, you know, if you're in Manila, you never really answer, you know, those types of questions, right? Whether it's a census survey, it's doing your tax, you know, we're like a pretty much like a homogenous population, right? Everyone has, you know, some Spanish in them and some, you know, indigenous Filipino. So everyone's kind of like mixed, and no one really asks like, you know, where are you from, like, or where are you from. And I got here, and it was, I think, the first week I had to fill out like 7 forms, and that was the first time that I, you know, thought, okay, I'm actually Asian, but you know, my last name's Suarez. So does that mean I'm Hispanic? So, and I was like searching, like, well, my mom speaks Spanish, but you know, I've never been to Spain. We've never really had like Spanish culture except for like lechon and leche flan, and you know, so it started kind of like my curiosity as to like how it plays. But you know, recently with, you know, the ICE policy, I've kind of, you know, come to realize, oh wow, you know, citizenship is a significant, you know, difference, right? There is privilege in, you know, having like American citizenship, and understanding that, you know, race is something, you know, biological, and ethnicity is something cultural. It's something I just like recently discovered too, and like because of crash course sociology. So
Yeah. Thank you. So thank you all for sharing that part of who you are and how you came to understand your own race and ethnicity. And Tasneem, you brought up kind of what is going to lead us into our next set of questions about this social construct of race, and it's being socially constructed, and it looks different based off different geographical environments, different contexts of different states even. And in the US, race has kind of impacted all of our systems and how we interact with one another, how we come to see ourselves and other people. And so moving into that, into a deeper conversation about whiteness, and a lot of times when we talk about systemic oppression and things that have happened in this particular nation, it is in the context of another group and against whiteness and what whiteness may or may not afford. So I'd love to hear from the panel here is, what is whiteness? And then also, what does that look like as it relates to you and your own experiences on this earth? And so, since Tasneem, since you started off, let's start with you. And if you could just share with us, and then anybody can just jump in and share their thoughts.
I think to be white is beautiful. Like, they're also humans, and it's like we're all humans, one, and race doesn't mean anything, but white people do receive a lot of privilege. This is kind of considered their country, and not mine or anything, even though I was born and raised here. So I think it doesn't really matter. Like like since this quarantine started, I don't even know what race is or ethnicity is. Like, I don't see what's the importance of this besides filling out an application. Because when we're with our friends or when we're with other people, you don't really see that unless you want to give that power to it. So to be white, it's just a box that says what's your race, but then on top of that, there's a lot of privilege that comes with being white. You don't have to worry about getting out of the house at a certain time. You don't have to worry about being chosen for this. You don't have to worry about going to a certain environment or neighborhood or interacting with someone, because to a lot of people, being white is a good thing. And it's not just in white culture, it's in a lot of cultures. It's in my culture as well. Being white is good. In terms of color, literal color, the fairer you are, the better you are. Or in terms of just being from a European country or being American, is just better for you. So you tend to have an easier life. I don't really know how it is to be white because I'm not white, but from seeing what I see and from seeing how other people interact with white people and how they interact with other people, I think being white is just privilege. Yeah.
Thank you. What are some other thoughts as to what is whiteness?
Most definitely. I've actually been thinking about this a lot, especially in my interactions with my family members and friends who are also white. And I think that up until now, my baseline definition of whiteness is being able to see other cultures and take popular things or popularized trends, but it's only a matter of convenience, because you're not forced to reconcile with the systemic oppression of people with different backgrounds. So this looks like a lot of ways. At Lehigh, I was just shocked to see how many people would just play hip hop and rap music at parties, sing along, use the N-word, and have that be a huge part of their culture. But then when we would, get together and have student organized protests for the whole housing thing where juniors and seniors were kicked off campus, none of those kids were there. It's caring when you want to, not when you have to, which is, for me, been a huge internal dialogue. But inherently, there's nothing wrong with being white. But if you're not using your platform to call out things that are actively oppressing other people within whatever system you're a part of, whether it's your job, your friendships, where you go to school, that's a responsibility that has to be a part of it. And until recently, I feel like the conversation never really moved in that direction.
Personally, well, not personally, but the official definition of white is anyone from Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. But in America, it's sort of like your whiteness is defined by what generation European that you are. So you could be someone from Germany or Italy and you move to America and you're a white American. But a white person from, say, Argentina or somewhere else, they immigrate to America and they're all of a sudden a person of color. Even though they're 100% white, they're directly descended from Europeans, they're automatically grouped into that person of color category. Same with people from the Middle East. On paper, they're white, they're Caucasian, but in America, they're considered people of color. So it's essentially like that one group of people has majority of the privileges of being white, while everyone else who technically is white, they're not really associated with that certain culture.
Yeah, and kind of like building on like what just Ray mentioned, whiteness, if you look, historically, is a dynamic social construct, right? Like, for example, like in the Philippines, because I'm like 2/3 like Spanish, I'm like considered like a mestizo, and like in our society, in our like culture, there's a privilege of like being like light skinned, so like the mestizos are the whites, right? And there's a certain privilege power associated with that. In America, it's interesting because, as Ray mentioned, right, like technically it's if you're from Europe, the Middle East, or I forget what was it, like North Africa, or what was it? North Africa. Now, if you look though in like during the colonial times, if you were German or Italian, right, you weren't considered white in the white standards, right? Because like the white standard was you had to be Protestant, you had to be British, and like your forebears would have been like here by 17 whatever. And now you look at it, it's changed. Like the definition now includes, okay, if you're from Europe, whether that's West, Europe or Eastern Europe, you're considered in a blanket of whiteness. But it's funny if you're biracial, right? Even if you just have like, I don't know, like your great grandfather was black, because there's that like 1/8 black in you, you're now considered like unwhite. Like, but what I'm saying? Like, if you flip that though, if like your great grandfather like was 1/8 like black, you're considered black. It just shows how all of it is a social construct, right? They're like labels that we've put into something which is so arbitrary.
Just going back to Tasneem's like perspective on it, I also see it like that as well. Like to me, whiteness is privilege, it's power, and it's like sadly, like it's a universal thing where like there's this hierarchy and like whiteness is at the top, and it's just like wherever you go, like we're always taught from a young age that like being white is better, it's prettier, it's more educated, and so yeah.
Also, I think one of the biggest privileges that comes with whiteness is just that idea of the invisibility of whiteness. And I remember, like, I've talked about this in classes before, like Africana studies classes and stuff, but it's that idea that, like, I feel like when you're not white, you have to talk about your race or your ethnicity all the time, and you have to go through this process of like self-exploration of what that is, because whiteness is almost considered the norm, especially here in America. It's like whiteness is the default, is the norm. So if you're white, you don't really have to take the time to explore that. So like, I mean, I've been in situations where like I've asked someone like, oh, like what's your race? And if they're white, they're usually like, well, like white. And it's like it's like obvious. Whereas I feel like that's not the same experience if you're not white, because it's almost as if white is the default. And I feel like there's a lot of privilege in that idea of being the default race.
Thank y'all for sharing that. That's a really great way to synthesize some of the thoughts and experiences, and even looking historically about how whiteness has shifted and changed over the course of our time, and what it looks like, and how that impacts us today. So when you think about what's going on right now in our country, what is whiteness, and what does that mean in the context of today?
I think that a lot of it goes on with writing your own narrative of stories and just completely discrediting and displacing voices from other races. Going back to what Gabby was saying, the default, yeah, like you don't have to explore it. That wasn't something that I had to do until I came to college. And, I'm in a conversation at the OMA in the M room where people are like, all right, so, what's your race? What's your ethnicity? It's something I would never have had to do had I not chosen to be in a space with a bunch of different cultures. And that in itself is wild. But today especially, it's just every narrative, especially when you look to the news, and whether it's a conservative outlet or a liberal outlet, if it's through a white lens, it often discredits Black and brown people as resources, as people who can speak up on an issue. And it's just kind of frustrating, because you're looking around at people who have opinions that are wildly wrong, and it's because they're only referring to a whitewash news source, or they're uncomfortable with acknowledging systemic oppression, and in their mind, oh, there's no way white people could have done this, or our laws could be this. And it's just not looking at the actual history. I see that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is being cited a lot as the equal opportunity. That's the same year Emmett Till was lynched, brutally murdered. His killers were taken to trial and they got off scot-free. Like the context behind that kind of thing, where it's the selective history of like, oh, well, we did this. Well, what was happening? What was the context? And not taking the history, like actual history, not just the whitewash history. Even when you look at Southern textbooks calling the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression, little things like that. That to me is what whiteness is leaning on, is rewriting history in a way that completely ignores the struggles created by white people for anyone who isn't white in America.
it brings me to this question. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, which is very contentious. I don't know if you all saw a video that was shared recently of some people walking by and they're like shouting white power. And so there's this conversation that is what it like when we talk about whiteness and what does whiteness mean? Can white people be proud of being white? And what does that even mean in the context of this historical and systemic pressure that whiteness has afforded, but also looking at, can white people be proud to say white power, and why or why not?
I say yes, they can be proud of being white. However, historically, like statements like white power have always been associated with white supremacy and anti-black rhetoric. So a lot of people are like trying to counteract that and saying that Black Lives Matter movements and Black Power are like being racist, or saying that Black people are trying to tell us that we're above everyone else. However, it's just a notion of equality. But white power is always trying to maintain the status quo of white people being the superior out of everyone in America.
Yeah, as someone who like initially wanted to be white, like when I got to like America, like I was like proud, like, oh, like I'm 2/3, like, my family's from Spain, so I'm like technically white, y'all. And then like technically, well, you're not. I think it, like whiteness, just as anything else, it's easy to generalize it, but it's a much more complex thing as well, because there's like multiple nuances to it. For example, I think like when we think about whiteness, it's like the stereotype now, especially in like because of all that's been happening, is that like white guy shouting like white power, and of the current administration, and the lack of like humanity there. But I think that's just a part of whiteness. There's like other spectrums to it. I think when we're thinking about whiteness, it's easy to kind of like stereotype them to like Southern people who have been kind of taught this whitewashed history, as like Joey was mentioning, specifically that of like the lost cause, right? When you're talking about like the Confederacy, and like they're taking pride in that, in something that has been warped. And I think in like the modern context, that's like the dangerous thing, is when like specific rhetoric, specific histories are warped, and histories that are about like oppression and about like degrading other human beings are rebranded as something to be proud of, right? And I think that's the dangerous slippery slope that anyone really can be culpable of.
I just think right now, for you to be a white person and to kind of shout through the streets white power is just a little I don't know what the word is, but it really kind of rubs me the wrong way. Just with what is going on, I think it's just like you're being a little dense. And it's just frustrating because, you can see these white people protesting, upset that they have to wear a mask for 30 minutes when they're in a supermarket, while there are, Black and brown people protesting the fact that they're being killed by, people who are supposed to protect them. And that, I feel like, just also is just, you can just see the privilege in like the protests of people being mad that they have to wear a mask. And, police officers are just standing there not doing anything. These people are shouting in their faces. They have guns, like doing all of this. And then you have like Black and brown people peacefully protesting for something that's so incredibly wrong that continuously happens. And then they get peppered sprayed, they get shot with rubber bullets. And it's just, when I like hear or see like these white people like saying like white power, like all these things, it's just so wild to me, because I'm like, are you not seeing what's going on? Like, what?
Talking about what Nat was just saying, I remember when COVID was taken more seriously, and people were told to quarantine, and the weather was getting hot. In New York, there is like a lot of parks, and in the rich areas, or like in the gentrified areas, white people would go to these parks and relax without a mask. And then 3 blocks down, there's a kid who's black and is getting arrested because he doesn't have a mask on. But then in the park, these people aren't wearing masks, and these police officers are willingly giving out masks and not arresting them or not telling them, hey, you can't be in the park. Whereas 3 blocks down, there's a black kid who's probably going to the grocery store to get milk or bread or something, just to eat and feed the family. So that doesn't make sense. And it's in a very diverse city. And it just goes to show you just 2 words: police brutality. Like, if you want to know if you have power in this country, just answer me this: if you go through that, if police make you uncomfortable, if they do anything to you, if they stop you. Because being black and the word police in one sentence don't really go together ever. And it's a scary thought. And it's just like, why? Like, why does someone's skin color have to define whether they get pulled over, stop and frisk, and so many other things that police members just do? Or they can do whatever they want. They can say, oh, my camera ended up not working, so I had to kill him, and that looked like a wallet, or that was a comb, or whatever it was. It's just, they can say whatever they want. And that's why, like, the idea of race not being real, but we give it so much power, is so destructive. And I think everyone needs to understand that. White, black, doesn't matter what you are, because it's to the point where it's not like we're giving it power. We've been forced to give it power. And because we've been forced to give it power, there's like a lot of ways where we can't get out of it. So like, there's a lot of kids who are scared to walk and from one block to another because they're like, mom, like, I don't want to die or whatever. I've seen this video. I don't even know where it came from, but this father was going to work or something, and the kid came in the car and was like, Dad, let me pray for you so you come back home. Like, why? Like, why is that necessary? Because another kid doesn't have to do that. Another kid's like, all right, Dad's going to work. Like, duh, like, let me go play on my PS4. Like, we're living in the same country, but completely 2 different experiences, and one's just very heartbreaking. And to say someone has white power, you shouldn't go out and protest that. Do something with that, because you do have power. And I'm happy that you realize that. So why don't you educate other people? Why don't you educate yourself? Why don't you educate your family? Why don't you do something with that great power that you have? Because you do have power. Everybody realizes that. But because you're going out and saying you have white power, you're de-escalating Black power and the Black Lives Movement.
It's also kind of interesting because when you think about it, like, usually, even like, I feel like even leftist, like white people don't like being told that they have white privilege, and they don't like to say, I have white privilege. They don't shout, I have white privilege. They say, like, white power. But if you really think about it, like, it kind of means the same thing. Like, white power and white privilege, it's the same thing. They just change the words a little bit. And I mean, they don't have to shout it because they already have it. That's like screaming white lives matter, but you don't need to scream that, because like, that's not something that you have to like advocate for, because it's something that you don't have to fight for because it already exists. And I mean, and that just goes to like when people say all lives matter and don't understand why people are saying Black lives matter. But like, kind of to Taz's point, even when you think about like police brutality and things like that, like the idea that you can like, white people can like get in a car and not have to worry, like when a police car is behind them and pulls them over, like they don't start sweating. They don't have to like learn from a young age the whole thing where like you keep your hands on the like headboard of the car and things like that. Like, those, not even small things, but those types of things are kind of create that difference and kind of make it so that you can't go through the streets and scream white power.
So when people say white power, the first thing I thought of, what are you proud of? Like, because when people are saying Black Power or like Chicano Power or something, like that's coming from like a place of like people were slaves. People were the only job they could work was like farming inside Texas or like Southern California. Like when people were saying white power, like I understand the concept of like being proud of like where you're coming from. So like if someone said Italian pride or if someone said Russian pride, like you're proud of your ethnicity. But when you say white power, like usually that's associated with violence and it's associated with things like colonization. So it's like, what are you proud of exactly? Like an ethnic pride, again, I would not conflate that with like something as trivial as white power, because I feel like it's a different conversation. It's just a different conversation.
Wow, those were a lot of great thoughts, and I want to kind of in a way shift the conversation and talking about the Black Lives Matter movement that has been around since 2013 in the formal sense, labeled Black Lives Matter. And this time, a lot of people have been saying something feels different this time. And to each person, that means something totally different. And so when we think about what Blackness is and what the Black Lives Matter movement is, as we talk about what is whiteness, I want to kind of move and talk about what is Blackness and what does it mean to be Black.
Well, to me, Blackness is more so how much people see you as Black. Like, there are people who are mixed race, biracial, but they have like phenotypical attributes of the whiter race. Um, so for me, Blackness is how much, like, if a white person were to be walking up to you in the street, would they see you as Black or would they see you as like whatever? And traditionally, it's always been like a more negative thing. Like, not even just in America, like any country that you go to. Like, my grandma, she's from Brazil. She's from the most African populated city in Brazil, and it's like one of the most poorest cities in the whole entire country. So traditionally, it's been associated with poverty and inferiority and usually just negative aspects. So that's what I kind of associate with Blackness. But it's also something that's really positive because Black culture is super influential. Like anywhere you go to, like the entire culture was probably built off of African roots. So that's my take on Blackness.
Thanks, Ray.
Yeah, I'd say adding on to that, like on top of like the whole it's seen in a negative manner, like for me, like in the context that I usually hear Blackness, it's always either being talked about anti-Blackness or like in social media, like you would see people saying like, oh, you need to love your Blackness because like society doesn't embrace it. But like for me, it's like, why can't we just love our Blackness because we want to and not because it has to be seen as like something that we have to do because society doesn't really embrace it, you know?
I definitely agree with that. Like in the media, like I feel like because we get so many bad representations of Black people and get on social media, a lot of times people feel like we need to say our melanin is popping, say like, but like even though like we should be saying that, shouldn't be reactionary. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel like we shouldn't have to embrace our Blackness because the media is telling us that Blackness is wrong. We should embrace our Blackness and love our Blackness because it's dope. It's amazing. It's so many things wrapped in one.
Being Black is multifaceted, and everyone has a different experience. And Black, when you think about the Black diaspora across continents, like that experience may look different, and there's a lot of shared things. And because of that, there's also some difficulty within that conversation about, well, who is Black and who gets to determine who is Black?
I feel like when everyone was talking about like the what is Blackness portion, there was this common thread of like us having to like own our Blackness or be like, yes, Black Lives Matter, yes, Black Power, and like kind of like love your melanin, love your Blackness because like society tells you not to, because like it's almost like Blackness comes with a connotation that's negative. And then when you think about why that is, it's because like if you look at all the subliminal messages in society, whether it be movies or books or like commercials or just anything around you in society, there's these subliminal messages that Blackness is bad, or like they usually have like the Black character in the movie, they die first, they speak in an uneducated fashion. They like all these different stereotypes just pile on top of one another, and that's like kind of what you grow up with as a child. And so even from little you get this message going into your brain that blackness isn't something that's good. So I feel like it's kind of like society deeming what blackness is, and then us having to, like, when you grow up you have to go and take it back and fight to show like why it's good almost.
I like a lot about what you said about being deemed by others. I was talking to one of my friends who was he just graduated last year, and as he was getting a job, he said he was going to have to get a haircut because he didn't think that his hair dreading out at the top was professional enough. And he also talked a little bit about code switching and having to speak in a different way around people at his company. And that just rubbed me the wrong way, because going back to what you were saying earlier about it being the default, I never have to look at how I present myself in a business or a work environment or how I talk. It's not something that has to be for me. And for other people to put that on you, I think that right now is how blackness is being failed by the systems it's interacting with, which is something that I hope to see change. I'm working on it within myself, and I'm trying to promote that idea amongst peers.
I want to piggyback on what Joseph and Gabby kind of both mentioned. It's kind of like, yes, society deems what is blackness, but a lot of times it's not really a full representation of blackness, because black people are not a monolith. There's light-skinned black people, there's dark-skinned black people, there's everyone in between. So a lot of times when you look on TV and there's the black character, the token black character, they're light-skinned, loose curly hair, and they have like a very anglicized accent. So it's like you're not really seeing, we are seeing black representation, but it's not a full encompassing representation of the entire black community.
I was actually just talking about this with like some family members. So my aunt, so she's like a Filipino. So she her husband, Fred, he is Filipino, like all Filipino. So they have 2 kids. So their kids like are like genetically, I guess, they're about 25% black. But they don't look like they don't look like us. And like we were like trying to like like I don't know why we were having this conversation, but we were talking about like whether or not we think that like when the kids got older, would they consider themselves to be black? Because like when you look at them, they just look Asian. So I feel like race in many ways is both how you look to others, but also how you identify. So I feel like were William and Harper to identify black, I mean I'm biased obviously, but yeah, I feel like they are black, even though they don't look like me, even though we don't have the same texture of hair. Like their mom's black, grandfather's black, like I'm their own, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I feel like it's a very complicated conversation.
I think that's a great point. Growing up in the South, honestly, you're either black or white, no matter what other ethnicity that you were a part of. You were in the black category or the white category, and it was basically some of those societal things about if you knew some hip hop music or if you knew certain words or who you hung out with determined if you were categorized as white or black. And so although the phenotypical, we can look and see like, oh wow, this person has darker skin, I may address them as black, or based off how they act, based off the stereotypes of being black, then we will put them in the category of being black. And when I reflected, and I had this conversation with Arlene as we were talking about this, it's like they're in that dichotomy of black and white, especially growing up in the South. I thought about all my friends who were either Mexican or Indian or whatever, and just depending on who they hung out with, we erased part of their identity just by saying, well, you're black or white. And if you just hung out with the white people, then we didn't acknowledge you as being black. And so thinking about who determines blackness is so important. And geographically, those things look so different. And I know moving to Pennsylvania, I was questioning a lot about what type of black am I? And it made me come, into myself, because I grew up in a culture where I just was automatically black. And then coming here, people want to know what type of black you are. And so I'm interested to see, I know Ray, you're from, Texas, and then Adrian, you being from the Philippines and growing up, this conversation of blackness and who gets to be black, and then who determines that. And so I appreciated you all's thoughts. Any other thoughts on that?
I guess this is coming from like an outsider, right? Like an un-American perspective. But to be honest, like when I'm reading through like history books, the one thing, like the one common theme that I pick up on is like resilience, right? When I think of, Black people, like imagine like an entire like race, an entire group, an entire family, genealogy, right? Like generations being oppressed, whether that's explicit, right, through like punitive, like words, and like through physical violence, or through like institutional, passive yet in a way more violent structures, right, that strip you of housing, strip you of access to education, strip you of generational wealth. And then to think about like how these individuals still find ways to raise a family, to instill values, to teach their kids that there is still something to be hopeful for. Like like at the back of my head, I'm just like, wow, this is like resilience, if there were any definition of it. And as someone who's trying to be anti-racist, right, pro-equity, I'm just humbled to kind of like hear a lot of like people's stories, especially those who because of their blackness have gone through struggle, but also in a way because of their blackness have come to know strength and willpower and determination, perseverance, and really at the heart of it, optimism amidst adversity.
As we wrap up this conversation, please remember that this will happen weekly, and this was kind of more of the broad topic, and then it's going to get deeper. I know there's going to be conversations about white privilege. There's going to be conversations about Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx, and who gets to claim that, what does that determine? So there are going to be a lot of different, more specific topics. And with this talk, we kind of wanted to talk broadly about race, ethnicity, and culture and nationality. And so before we close off, I would love to have each panelist, just from the conversation that we've been able to have today in a short time, and please don't let this stop here in this moment, but what is one thing that you would like for people to know as it relates to race and race relations, something that, with all the things going on right now, that you're like, if I could get this one message out to people, if I could just broadcast my message to the world so the world could hear me, what would that message be as it relates to race, racial reconciliation, systemic racism, whatever it may be? What is that one message that you would want to share out to everybody today?
For all of my allies out there, seek to understand before seeking to be heard. That's the best way to learn.
Just say do your research. Just do your research. So race and ethnicity, like they work very different ways in different places. So just do your research, and especially in regards to systemic racism in an American context, because like we're mostly speaking from an American context, but there have been many different ethnic groups that have been disenfranchised all across the world, like this systemic racism, all the everything going on in China and everything, like it's larger than just an American context. That's just what I want everyone to leave.
Kind of going off of what Jamal said, I think the idea of like race is kind of like an iceberg. Like it's not just what you see on the surface, and we kind of started talking about this towards the end, but like it's not just white or black. Like there's so many other factors that play into race, and I feel like it's just important for people to do research on that, and like to take the time to understand the differentiations with that, and to take the time to ask someone rather than just assume.
Kind of saying the same thing. I think respect and empathy are two different things that you should always like move, like, because for a lot of white people, I've been seeing that they've been denying the existence of white privilege and things like that, and a lot of black people have been denying the struggles of other different ethnic groups outside of black and white. So I think it's just kind of respect for everyone's different experiences and what they're going through in their own life.
I think that I would like to get out the idea of educating yourself and educating other, and that includes doing your research. But on top of that, actually know what you're posting on your Instagram stories, or any social media, because you're part of that now. So do your research and don't just be like, oh my God, yeah, really? Okay, and then just repost it, because that doesn't really do anything. You could seem like you're really woke and educated to other people, but are you really benefiting from it? You're probably not. And then on top of that, do not feel scared to call people out on something that they're wrong for. Like if you think that you're gonna lose a friend or that makes you look bad, oh well, because I don't even think that was beneficial for you in the first place. So when you see something, say something. Always.
Going off of that, also being okay with admitting that you were wrong, like after you like did your research and like you learned some stuff. Like we're all learning. I'm unlearning stuff, and it's okay to do that and take a step back and just be like, you know, I was wrong. And I think that's really important.
Okay, so something that's really important to me is just like for people to learn that there's not just one way to be a particular race, and just how Tasneem had started off like the conversation when she had said that like typically like Pakistani people and Bengali people, like they are considered Asian, but you usually think when you usually think of Asians, like you usually think of like Chinese people or Japanese people. Like I really think that people have to like be more open-minded, that like you can be of the same race but like not ethnicity. So I just think that's just something that like people have to learn.
My takeaway from all this really is that race is beautiful. I mean, I think this panel has, shown like with the diversity of races and ethnicities, it is beautiful. But I think being sensitive historically, how race has been perverted by some people, especially those in power, to create systems of oppression, and how to undo that we need to create like systems of equity, and to achieve that you need to be politically engaged. And if there's any like one word I can say to people, it's vote. Right? Don't just let woke in a state being woke like your tagline, but be it that I voted.
Did get a question from the audience, and I do want to give that person respect. And Jamie asked, we spoke a lot about race as a social construct. Do you feel as though this idea progresses or hinders providing social justice to Black Americans? Any thoughts on that? Thanks, Jamie, for that great question.
I mean, for me personally, that's like a question I have myself too, just because like I remember one of my first classes in my first semester at Lehigh, like the way our professor taught race to us was like it's an illusion, it's a social construct, and like I know a lot of people think of it as like a simple categorization, but I feel like it erases the fact, like when people say that like race isn't real or that it doesn't exist, it erases the fact that it's something that it's a categorization that has had like an immense impact on like so many generations in different various points of history. So that's like something that like that's a question I struggle with too.
I feel like it depends on the way it's used as a social construct. So like she said, does it progress or hinder providing social justice to Black Americans? It could progress it if people are looking at race as a social construct and kind of analyzing the psychological processes going on in people's minds when they see different races. Like there are different studies of are police more likely to like think it's a phone or think it's a gun based on race and things like that. And I feel like understanding those differentiations associated with race and its social construct are important.
One thing I will add going off of that, it is important to understand at least that the social construct and the fact that we're all human, but that doesn't mean that there are not very real problems created by either racist laws or racist systems that oppress people based off of race, which is the social construct. So if you don't oversimplify it and say, oh, it's a social construct, everything's fine, then I think there's a whole lot of legitimacy to addressing it. However, it can be used as, like we were talking about earlier and what Carla was bringing up, as a way to kind of write off racism, and that definitely is not acceptable.
I think I agree with what everybody else said too. I think that because for the duration of this country, when we think about the history of the indigenous people to this land, Black people, any other race or ethnicity that hasn't been historically white or benefited from the systems that have been at play, I think in order to undo them, sometimes we have to look at those categories to see how have these people been disenfranchised culturally, systemically, institutionally. And so I think the progresses have to be on those markers the same way we would do it with other communities such as LGBT or women. Like, we have systemically disenfranchised those groups historically, and to provide access, we need to make sure that we are giving benefits and directly impacting those communities that have been disenfranchised. So I think in those ways it progresses. I think when we look at things interpersonally or personally, it could seem as a hindrance, but I think that is us doing a self-evaluation and check about where we stand, and not recognizing that what your race is, you are less than, but your race or how you've seen in this country does impact the experiences that one has had. And to the last question too, I think someone said it, I think Nat said it, so much of this talk about race and ethnicity has been about learning things while also unlearning things. So if there's anything that we would like to take from this, in addition to all the great things the panelists said, is really looking at the things that we've learned and unlearned in our histories, the things that we pick up on just personally, and what messages are we sending to ourselves when it comes to race, blackness, whiteness, social justice, equity, all of those things, and that empathy that is so important. Like, how can we live a life of empathy where we are making the world better for the people who've been at the margins the most? So I want to just take this time to thank our wonderful panel for their great insight. Thank you to all the attendees for being here with us today. We went over a little bit, over 6 minutes, but this conversation is so important we could go on for the rest of our days. And so I'm glad that you all stayed with us. And thank you all so much for a wonderful panel. And I hope you all have a great day and join us next week.